usar o microfone, porque além de estarmos gravando, a mesa nós estamos também traduzindo simultaneamente. É um prazer enorme estar aqui mediando essa mesa. Agradecer mais uma vez o convite feito pela Maria Fernanda, pelo André, pela Thaís, para compor essa comissão organizadora desse evento. E em razão do evento tão intenso, eu já vou passar diretamente a palavra aos palestrantes. Convido primeiro o professor Nicholas Bromley, do Departamento de Geografia da Universidade Simon Fraser, Canadá, com a palestra Governando a Posse de Moradores Precários, uma geografia jurídica crítica. Em seguida, a gente vai ter o professor Edward Kirton Darling, da Faculdade de Direito da Universidade de Kent, e depois, por fim, o professor Lachlan Martin, da Universidade de Free State. Nós vamos ter em torno de uma apresentação de 20 minutos cada um, e aí em seguida a gente abre para debate, perguntas e considerações finais. Combinado? Então, professor Nick.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
I'm very impressed with the stamina of the Brazilian talent. I am also, I'd like to say, obrigado and also Nani and Ellen who helped me get here. My name is Nick Longley. I come from Vancouver, Canada, and I want to talk about a project that I'm working with two other lawyers. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a geographer, Alexandra Flynn and Javier Silvestre, both Canadian lawyers. And this is a very new research project. We just started the project in the last few months. It's an empirical project. It brings together questions of legal space, of housing, precarity, and property, but property both in land and in possessions, personal property. And what I'm going to do very quickly is just lay out the issue for you and some preliminary concepts that we're working with. So these are very preliminary ideas. I'm very interested in your thoughts on the paper and, of course, suggestions for the project itself. Can we have the next slide, please? So I'm going to begin with a story. This comes from the west coast of Canada. It's in the winter, it's very cold, it rains a lot. And a man we'll call Ken was sleeping outside, he was homeless. And he faces a very brutal dilemma. He wakes up in a leaking tent. So his choice is to leave the tent out and hopefully it dries overnight during the day. But he faces the risk that the tent will be seized or even destroyed by the authorities. Or he can pack up the tent and take it with him as he goes into town, presumably to find food, but he risks hypothermia the next night. And so he says, I set up my tent, when you go to bed now, everything is already wet. Luckily, I woke up in the morning, and I didn't freeze that night. And so I packed up, and I bicycled to town, and I knew that day that when I go home tonight, I am going to die. Not because I want to. And my only option is to leave my things. And my only option to leave my things set up wasn't an acceptable one either, because if people, and he means the state officials see it, they will destroy it. Fortunately, a friend helped him find a bed, and so, as he put it, I didn't die that day. So this is the issue that we're trying to explore, the possessions of what we're calling precariously housed people. By precariously housed people, obviously we mean homeless people, but also people who are living in shelters, people who are living in private rental housing, which would be very insecure, people who may be living in cars. Possessions, the personal property, which are very diverse. They can be animals, they can be memorabilia, they can be drug paraphernalia. Their possessions are located on the land and thus the control of private and public agents like landlords, churches, businesses, and the state. As people move between these spaces, and of course people do move between these spaces, their possessions frequently become subject to the control or the will of other people, which creates a potentially hostile regulatory environment governing their personal possessions. This has many consequences, one of which we suspect, and we've got evidence for it, is that it enhances people's precarity. People who are already precarious become even more precarious as a consequence. So there are lots of examples of this. Oh no, sorry, back to one. Back one. Yes. No. Yeah. Next one.
Sorry.
No. Okay. Yeah. I think that's the right one. Tell me if it's not the right one. For example, people who rent in the private rental sector, as well as who rent in other sectors, frequently experience eviction, in which themselves and their possessions are expelled from the space. Landlords may legally or illegally seize or destroy their possessions. Homeless people occupying state-owned land may find their possessions confiscated by city officials, be regarded as stolen goods, garbage, or obstruction. People who camp together to protect their belongings, and that's why people often do camp together, may find that this very spatial concentration of people and their things may lead to regulatory action, that leads to a state response, including wholesale sweeps, wholesale state actions, leading to the destruction of tents, of clothing, of sleeping bags, and all the other possessions that people have. Forced to store possessions in private storage lockers, and in North America there's been a massive growth in these private storage lockers, which very often has to do with the, I think, insecurity of the housing market. Forced to store possessions in private storage lockers because of evictions or foreclosure, or because people are arrested. Poverty or foreclosure may lead to liens, and a lien, of course, is the transfer of property because of the non-payment of debt. Forced auction of somebody's property because of the non-payment of debt. Criminalised people may be put up in police harassment that targets their personal possessions. And the police of many inner city areas frequently seize personal property, presumably stolen or simply because it's a means by which they can harass marginalised people. People's animals may be seized because they do not have a license. This can be a serious problem. So the next question is, why does this matter? No? Okay. Maybe go forward. Yeah.
Não sei. Não, eu acho.
Oh, okay.
Nossa, tá demais. Eu sei, é só que eu não tô achando.
My slides have changed slightly, so let's just think about why this matters. And we think this matters for a variety of reasons. One, most immediately, as I've suggested, is that this is a situation that can enhance people's precarity. People who are already vulnerable may find themselves in enhanced forms of vulnerability. Having more possessions, if you're homeless, may provide more protection for you if it's cold and wet. But this also creates more visibility. You become more of a potential target for regulators. And there's also evidence of health problems exacerbated by property seizure or the threat of seizure. It also raises some crucial questions about equality and personal dignity. The American scholar Bernadette Atuaheli has some powerful scholarship around the concept of dignity takings, where dignity takings are... there it is. And suddenly it's in English. I can read it now. It's a miracle.
They come.
Maybe you learned Portuguese.
There we go. Portuguese, it's been so long.
We will translate.
Yes. Dignity taking, so a wrongful seizure, thank you very much. A wrongful seizure tied to the dehumanization of people. So it's not just the seizure of the stuff, it's also the dehumanization that's crucial here. Now what's striking is that, at least in the literature that I have seen, this topic has not been studied at all. There is a massive gap in the literature. There are only small interventions that talk about maybe homeless people and their animals, but systematically this has not been studied at all before. So this to me seems a massive scholarly gap. Perhaps it has in Brazil, and if it has, I'd be interested to know about that. It's also interesting in one sense because the focus is in part about personal property. And if you know anything about property, you'll know that at least in the tradition I know, it's land that is always the focus. It's never personal property. And so I think it's important to think through personal property, but in part in relation to land. Now we're thinking these concepts, we're thinking about this through a couple of concepts, just 3 for now, and then I'm done. So hopefully the next one is that one, yes. The precarious geographies of property. Everything has to happen somewhere. We need land for human survival, we need land for human flourishing. Property law structures the relations that we have to land and to others and the spaces that make life possible for us. In law, at least in the common law, we all access land through others and in relation to others. We never access land on our own, it's always through others. Precariously housed people, of course, access shelter for themselves and their possessions through the conditional legal permissions of more powerfully protected legal actors, like landlords or owners of storage lockers or municipalities. So legal precariousness in this sense is not a condition, it's a relationship. I have a piece that's coming out of the journal Antipope that tries to unpack this a little more systematically. In thinking about legal precariousness through a geographic lens, it's crucial to be a little more dynamic, avoiding a static analysis, but try to think about the way in which regulation and people move across regulatory fields. And so we hope in our project to follow people and their things as they move between and negotiate different spaces, being outside, being in a shelter, being in private rental. Remembering that people and things become different legal objects as they move between these spaces. So a tent can be personal property, it can be a home, it can be an obstruction, depending on its location. So that's the first concept. The second concept is valuation or devaluation. And these regimes, these governance regimes, as well as the ways in which people think about their stuff, can be thought of through the lens of valuation. We define valuation as, quote, any social practice where the value or values of something is established, or assessed, negotiated, provoked, maintained, constructed, and or contested. And there is some very interesting recent scholarship actually on evaluation. This is from the Journal of Evaluation Studies. So you know it must be a new thing. And to me this is very useful because it takes us away from trying to determine the value of something and rather looking at the practices through which objects and people are made valuable or are devalued. How do owners value their possessions? How do regulators? What frames do they use? And in part, we're trying to recognize the valuation of objects is linked to the valuation of people, which in turn is linked to the valuation of the spaces in which they are located. So some cities in my part of the world are trying to ban shopping carts in business areas. This is not because they have an objection to shopping carts. Clearly, it's because they have an objection to the people who are attached or assumed to be attached to those shopping carts, which in turn rests on some assumptions about the value of the space, public spaces, the business areas in which they are located. The third and final thread, and then I'll stop. This is, I'm just beginning to think this through, is the relationship between personhood and property. What sort of legal subject is being constructed here, or being imagined here, both by regulators and by those who own possessions? Conventional liberal accounts, of course, view property as a bastion of freedom, autonomy, and liberty. This is, of course, because they start from what they imagine to be the core of property, secure home ownership. As we know, the core is in fact not the core is the exception. Most people are precarious to varying degrees. It's clear that most precariously housed people do not have expectations of autonomy, freedom, and liberty. They are positioned as dispossessive subjects, people who can and should lose possession and ownership of their things. And this is what one of the people I interviewed, the woman, described when she was describing the experience of loss that she and many other precarious, mostly homeless people was. She described it as, quote, the hum of loss, a constant noise, a constant white noise, a sense of constant loss. As she puts it, it's the same story over and over again by different people. It's the same story. Oh my God, they took my stuff. Oh my God, they stole my stuff. That fucking goof stole my stuff. Can you believe it? They took my stuff. This is the dispossessive subject, I think, in action. And unlike the secure, masculine, bounded, Lockean subject, the dispossessive subject lives in a space of impermanence, of permeability, of radical exposure, the expectation of loss, creating this undertone of this hum of loss. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have questions or thoughts, I'd welcome them very much.
Yeah, please. Edward Kirton Down from Cidade. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you once again to you all for being here this evening. As Nick says, very impressed by your stamina. It is a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to, what I wanted to start with was to reflect on some of the conversations that we've had and pull out some particular points that were made that I feel have really spoken to me and really speak to the paper that I'm going to talk through. So Denise opened, or said at the start of the first session that it's important for us to that it's important for us to take away stories of what you do here and what you do in this law school and what you do as an academy. And the only word for it is that it is inspirational. It is inspirational, the work that you do, and I will take it away, and I've reflected on it to a small extent in this paper, but it's also something that I think blows my mind. So I want to give credit for that, and I want to say that that's an important part of what we're here for. What's my concern in being here to talk? My concern is around depoliticisation. I'm going to be focusing on this question. I know that we're all here on a Friday night to hear about English legal education. I know that that's the topic that keeps everyone awake and excited at night. But I want to talk about depoliticisation, and as Dani says, drawing on Nancy Fraser, the way in which the technicalisation can very easily feed in, and how important it is to hold on to the politics and think about the politics of things. And I also want, drawing on what Julie said about the importance of listening humbly and carefully and openness. I've been doing that over the last few days, and it's been just fascinating hearing everyone's pieces. But also the need for courage and for training. And I'm focusing particularly on the critical role of legal education, because training of lawyers is about the training of future judges and about the training of the profession. And although I'm going to be talking a bit about fracturing of the legal profession, there is still something in lawyering which is important in terms of the practice of lawyering. So I'm going to be focusing on this question of the social housing and the role of lawyers in relation to social housing. So yeah, great, thanks. So I gave a paper in Kent when some people here were over for the second seminar. This is the third seminar of three, and I talked about a new approach to training lawyers in England and Wales, and about radical lawyering in that context. I'm going to quickly recap that paper for those of you who weren't here, or for those of you who unbelievably might not have held on to every detail of it. And I want to talk about the law clinic specifically, the law clinic in England and Wales and the rise of clinical legal education. And then I'm going to turn to talk about radical lawyering, clinical legal education, and housing rights, and that will be do. So Okay. Oh, and I draw on this Hilbeck's typology of cause lawyering, and just to pull out a few parts of what's here behind me. He identifies three ways in which cause lawyers, so you might, campaign lawyers, people who are interested in trying to affect social change, three types of ways in which they might approach the question of lawyering. The first being a proceduralist approach, in which law and politics are two separate matters, and there's this emphasis on representing the client effectively, and the lawyer is a servant, a neutral representative. And then the second typology, which is the idea of the lawyer as leader, the elite vanguard. Law is the best form of politics. The emphasis is on a legal outcome, but it's the lawyer leading the charge, going out and finding the client and saying, here's a matter that needs work doing on it, so I'm going to work in that area, so taking forward particular cases. And then finally, grassroots lawyering, so in which law is another form of politics, often an inferior form of politics, and the legal system is corrupt, unjust, unfair. And the emphasis is on a substantive social justice, political success, and lawyers and clients are active parties. And I think it's important to say that I think people can move between these typologies. I was a lawyer in practice in England doing human rights work, and I can see circumstances in which you can move between these different typologies, but I think they're a useful way of talking about some of the themes that I'm going to talk about. So that's why I've chosen to focus on. Okay. So, quickly recapping my earlier paper. At the moment, if you want to become a solicitor or a barrister in England and Wales, solicitors are the high street lawyers, barristers are the advocates in court, and solicitors are the vast majority of the legal profession. So I'm going to focus on solicitors. I am myself a solicitor. If you want to become a solicitor at the moment, you have to do a 3-year or 4-year law degree, which is a qualifying law degree. And then you do a 1-year vocational course, and then at least 2 years legal practice with a firm. And the people who are in charge of regulating the solicitor's profession have proposed to abolish this route, this style of becoming a lawyer, this approach, and introduce what they're calling the solicitor's qualifying exams. These are made up of 2 sets of exams, and a period of qualifying workplace experience. SQE1, the first exam, is 2 days of multiple choice questions where you have 11 hours over 2 days to answer hundreds of questions, about 2 minutes a question, which will test very shallowly some understanding of legal concepts. The second test is SQE2, and that's a test of skills, advocacy, legal drafting. And then you have to do a minimum of 2 years work experience, but importantly, that experience is only signed off by a lawyer to say that you have the opportunity to practice, not to gain competences. The lawyer is not signing you off, as they currently do, to say you're good enough to practice. All they're doing is signing you off to say you have an opportunity to practice. And this is important because, well, I'll come to rights. So that's the proposal. There's been a huge amount of criticism of it. I think it's a terrible idea. I want to talk about a little bit. I'll talk about the SQE1 very quickly, and then I'm going to focus particularly on qualifying work experience aspect. So the argument that I made in the first paper was that this focus on a high-speed, high-stakes test of ability to cram and recite will result in a division in legal education in which some universities will focus on preparing people to pass this exam, some universities will focus on a more liberal approach to legal education, and that there will be necessarily a split. The more social capital you have, the more likely you are to go to one of the universities which does liberal education, and the more focused you are on getting into practice and potentially less information rich, you will maybe go to one of the other universities. And my concern is that it will have a number of impacts. It will mean there's less coverage of substantive housing law, areas of housing law, and less space for courses like the course I teach on homelessness law, the regulation of homelessness, and less space for alternative perspectives and critical reflections on law. For example, a leading provider has promised to do an 8-month-long course which will do what you're now doing in 4 years for anyone who wants to get there. So there's going to be this restriction, a kind of reduction of what it means, what legal knowledge is. And so I think there's a potential positive impact for these categories of the procedural approach and the elite vanguard, because the procedural approach doesn't really matter what your politics are because they're transferred between all different areas. So, there's no people who do this, who take this approach, may still be able to get into legal aid, practicing housing law or other areas of law. And there will always be people who go to the top universities who then become senior barristers who adopt a kind of lawyer as leader approach. I take the big case and I'll make the big argument and I'll win that case. And I don't want to overstate, but I'm really concerned about the space for people to go into more grassroots areas of law, the opportunities that there will be to do legal education in a way which focuses on a more grassroots approach because of this division into different sections of education. We'll talk more about that if you're interested. But I also don't want to overstate that at the moment it's easy to get into trying to do grassroots law, to work in a law centre or do other kind of NGO kind of grassroots lawyer, because it's already very difficult, but I think this is going to make it much harder. I think there's a risk of closing down imaginings, of closing down of the ways to be a lawyer and the ways to be a citizen. And I want to ask students, what kind of lawyer do you think this is going to make you? And that's the question I'm posing to my students, and I want them to be thinking about. What kind of lawyer does this course seek to produce? And I'm keen to think about exposing students to options, ideas, and critique. So, all right, with that kind of overview, I want to turn to talk about the law clinic in England. Okay, that's quite well, but that's fine. Basically, the main point is that clinical legal education has grown exponentially in the past kind of 30 years. So in 1996, there were 8 law schools that had live clinics, and now there are 118 clinics registered with LawWorks, and a huge number of cases being dealt with. I think it's important to understand a little bit about the context of lawyering in the UK, which is that it's very individual, there's very little in the way of sort of class actions. The way that the legal services market is structured, it's generally an individual client and you generally represent an individual rather than doing kind of more collective work in terms of representation. There's also people doing, okay, so on the next slide, there's a diversity of clinical legal education. So only a quarter of law school clinics are, a quarter of clinics in law schools are part of a course. So you get credit for your law degree by taking part in the clinic. But only a quarter of those clinics do more than initial advice. So students are getting, the majority of students who are doing clinical work are only focusing on initial advice and not taking the case further, doing potential representation and so on. And then clinics also do a whole range of different, have a different range of different clinics doing subject specific, people doing street law, so doing kind of public legal education work, and people focusing on innocence projects generally in prisons. You also have a situation of some law schools have separate staff who are only focused on clinical legal education, which is the situation in Kent, and some have those staff integrated into the department. And then there's various different ways that they can be regulated. So, yeah, thanks. What I wanted to really talk about is this question of what the purpose of clinical legal education is and how that relates to these changes and how it relates to the kind of concerns that I have. And a recent book called Reimagining Clinical Legal Education has defined clinical legal education as the learning of the law and its implementation in the real world through action and reflection that has educational, public interest and employability benefits. And other people have talked about clinical legal education aiming to expose students to social injustices and to the potential and limits of the law in addressing those injustices. And Sandbach and Johnson talk about clinics being the gateway to and vanguards of social justice movement lawyering. I want to pick up on some of those. I'm interested in the use of vanguard there in the context of the typologies that I talked about and this emphasis on social justice. And these last two quotes in particular bring us back to the typologies that I talked about and the need to critically reflect on claims of social justice and clinical legal education. And so I'm seeking to make an argument that the categories of benefit proposed, benefit of employability, education, public interest, can be mapped neatly, and I think maybe too neatly, but this is an argument I'm putting out there, onto the typologies of cause lawyering. So that a proceduralist approach to cause lawyering is a real focus on employability and on the capacity to be employed post-education. That an emphasis on an elite form of cause lawyering links to an educational perspective, a particular idea that you have to learn the law in order to be able to find the gaps and then take them forward and fight the fight in a particular case. And I think it's a problematic term by taking from Vaughan and the others that grassroots approach to clinical legal education focuses on public interest. So political success is the main focus as part of a wider movement, and student legal skills are developed as part of a wider understanding of law as politics. And I'm concerned that a social justice framing and a procedural perspective means that people learn how to do law for the poor and then go do it for the rich, resulting in potential undercutting of legal services for the poor and a further shift to pro bono provision. And similarly, a risk of elite framing is this learning how to do law for the poor and then going and doing it for, again, doing to people, finding gaps on the law rather than doing it on behalf of people rather than doing the grassroots approach. And so, I mean, I wanted to turn to is there a tension between a kind of instrumental framing and a grassroots approach? And I think that there is. I think that it's wrong to argue that something should be for employability reasons and then try and sneak in a grassroots approach. And I think, I mean, an example I would give, I don't want to criticise this particular project, but if you could go to the next one. This is a project run by another university in the UK, which is in many ways a very impressive project. But what I wanted to point to in particular is that if you look at where it's placed on the website, it says Home School of Law, Careers and Employability, Legal Outreach Collaboration. This is a unique and innovative project bringing together universities, law firms, barristers, to educate, assist, monitor and promote access to justice for disadvantaged communities. And it's framed as employability. It's framed as do this in order to get a better job at the end of the day. And what's quite interesting about this emphasis on employability is that research suggests that many employers don't know anything about clinical legal education, and those that do don't particularly give any value to it. It's not seen as necessarily a valuable matter, and so a lot of the discourse in clinical legal education is about explaining the value of clinical legal education to employers who continue to rely on other markers to choose students, including social class and other perceptions, other additionality matters. So I also have this concern that there's an emphasis in undergraduate clinical legal education, moving towards an emphasis on legal education being about commercial awareness. And there's one piece of research that said that the thing that's missing from clinical legal education is a commercial awareness emphasis, and the clinic needs to provide more exposure to commercial realities. So, yes, thanks. It's worth saying that the clinical legal education academic community is very excited by the solicitors qualifying exams, because there's, in particular, the qualifying work experience aspect of it has been, the solicitors regulatory authority has said that you could get time off your training if you spend time in the law clinic. So do your time in the law clinic, do your credit bearing module where you advise a client, and then you can get time off your qualifying work experience through that route. And the other emphasis is on this idea of much more emphasis on transferable legal skills. So if you know how to do, fill in a claim form, then you can do it for anyone. The proceduralist framing is really emphasised, I think, in the particular set of examination. But I think that there's space here for something a bit more exciting. And again, I come back to what inspires me about what you guys do, because I wonder whether or not, and this is my final slide, this solicitors qualifying exam is poorly designed with the wrong priorities and has been badly implemented. But I think it might open up some possibilities to bring into the legal academy some of the things you do here at Pós. A chance to embed some of the values of radical lawyering, grassroots lawyering that you have, as I say, inspired me in relation to. And so I think we need to focus in the UK on the ways in which legal education frame legal practice, and we need to respond to that critically and provide space for our students to think about things alternatively. And if the ability to get people qualifying work experience through something like Pós is an opportunity, is possible, I think it might be, then I think that it's potentially an exciting kind of moment. But the other thing we need to be thinking about is the way in which the legal profession is changing. A fracturing profession with increased automated decision making, machine learning, and it's important that when thinking about the future of social justice lawyering, grassroots lawyering, that we're preparing people for a changing world. That's, I think, what I'm going to say. So thank you all very much for staying on.
Thank you, Ed. Now, Professor Lopes Marret, Universidade of Free State.
Right, so I've titled this something along the following lines: Housing Pathways, Housing Policy in the Courts in South Africa. So the short version of the story is basically that I took 3 court cases and I tried to work out what type of meaning to the word home, what type of meanings to the word home are being given in these court cases. So that's what I'm trying to do in the paper. I'm going to, if you go to the next slide, just very briefly. So generally, housing research tends to sort of be theoretical, and often they use sort of universal simplistic assumptions. And what doesn't take place is the meaning is often articulated, or meaning is often articulated in policy terms or universally acceptable concepts. And it underplays the ability of people to actually articulate what they mean by housing and by home in this regard. So is there a different way of understanding housing and home? In the housing research, the sort of approach of housing pathways is often used. It lies within social constructionism. It emphasizes people's experiences and attitude. This next one, sorry. Yeah, that's it. It's associated often with late modernity, and it concentrates on the actions of people and households in relation to the house, as opposed to seeing the house as a final object in itself. It's often about lifestyle choices. The focus can be either on the individual or the household, and it builds on some initial work of housing careers, but it tries to emphasize the meaning of these careers through pathways. But there's also in the theory some emphasis on what people actually do, what's the agency of people, as well as what are the structural constraints in society in this regard. Okay, so what I'm trying to do is I'm going to try very briefly to say what is a way of understanding home, and then I'm going to very, very briefly tell you what is in the policy, and then a bit more detail about how these elements have been put out in 3 court cases in South Africa, and then to try to say, well, what does it mean, and is there a different way, is there a conflict between how these judgments or how lawyers take these cases to court and what we think it could be in practice. So trying to understand what all of this then means. You can go to the slide with examples. Next, we can go to the next one. Oh, yeah. So what I did there is, this is sort of one way of conceptualizing home. You'll see there are 12 things on the left-hand side, ranging from emotions, back region, etc., with a sort of a definition what it's meant in this regard. So I'm not going to read through it now for the simple reason that we're going to come back to some of these things and I'll show you what the important things are. I think the main point is that there are sort of these 12 things. It is a UK-based study that used this, and there are some issues that we can add to the understanding of home, not just to law, but also to this list of things that I'll come back to a little bit later. So what I did here is just to say, if you look at the South African policy, and I looked at the main policy, so it's a white paper in 94, 95, there's a revision of this. And I tried to code this, and I didn't. There's also, Donnie always reminds me, there's a set of eviction law which actually talks about home very briefly. In the main housing policies, the word home is not used. Okay, so this is the main policy concept. What you need to note sorry, it's the next one. So you need to go on to the next slide. So
Yeah.
there we are. Okay, so what you need to see is the major emphasis in policy on ownership. All right. So there's a huge. So when I coded this is what it came out. So I coded for each one of those things, and the major emphasis on ownership. No reference to the word home in those policies. Although in eviction law there is some reference to it, and I'm going to talk about 2 eviction cases, and I'll get back to that in a minute or 2. All right. So what I did was to take 3 cases. The first case is the Clark and others. It's a case where black people settled on a commercial farm owned by a white farmer in the Northwest Province. Effectively, there were 2, in terms of South African law, there were 2 types of people that invaded this land. There were people that had a fairly lengthy stay in there, and there were people that, over time, in the more recent past, before the case settled there. So there were 2, and this is an important distinction in the eviction environment in South Africa, is how long have you actually been there, and who gave you permission to be there. That's the 2 cases. And in this specific case, my analysis is about the affidavits that were in front of the court case, because the court never made a judgment on the case. It was settled outside the court, and basically the settlement outside meant that those people that were long enough there, they could remain. It was about 18 households. And I think the other 700 people had to be resettled, and the resettlement had to be done by the local government. So local government had to take responsibility for these 700 people, settle them elsewhere. I'm going to come back to this in some sense, but that's more or less the case. Then there's this case, Yafta versus Skuman and others, and in very simple terms, it's a case from a small town in South Africa where Mrs. Yafta owed Skuman some money. She didn't pay the debt, and it was money unrelated to the property. She then, Mrs. Skuman then went to attorneys, and they went through a legal process, and they managed through that legal process to dispossess a house that Mrs. Yafta had. This house was actually given by the South African government. So those huge emphasis on ownership, it was part of a government-driven program that provided about 4 million houses. In today's terms, such a house would be in the vicinity of about $12,000. And effectively, she lost the house because she had this debt that she didn't pay. All right, so it went through various court cases. It went to the Constitutional Court as well. Effectively, it was already the High Court overturned that she couldn't lose the house through this debt process. In the same town, there was also someone else that went through the same process. So there was an attorney that was actively driving these type of cases and dispossessing people through a housing that the government actually provided to them. My emphasis here is not on the legal issues, so I'm going to focus more on how home has been articulated in the judgment here. But I need to say this, a key issue here, the way I understand it was, so Donnie has spoken about the progressive right to housing in South Africa. In this case, that has already been given to someone. So the idea about progressive use or progressive right to housing was not used. The judges didn't focus on that part. They said it was already given to people. The third case is the major case in South Africa that went to the Constitutional Court. People from, typically the way we were out on Wednesday, people that rented backyard shacks moved onto open land. The municipality got a court order to evict them from that land. They moved onto a playing field next to a community hall. And nobody really worried, and they then went to the Constitutional Court and managed to get an order that says that government should, in this progressive right to housing, should actually make a plan and provide it to them. So that's the court stuff, Donnie. I'm always worried that I give the wrong legal impressions. But my focus here is not on the legal argument. So my focus is trying to say, okay, what in these affidavits, in the first case, and in the judgments in the other two cases, what do we learn about home in this process? So, my colleagues were laughing at me the other day when I said it's not, the important thing about data is not what it shows you, it's what it hides. Okay? So I'm going to show you now, I'm going to first show you the data, and then I'm going to show you what it hides. Okay? So what I literally did on case one, I worked through the affidavits because there was never a judgment on this. So I worked on the affidavits, and there were huge emphasis on the stories of people saying, I've got children, I'm poor, so the children stuff would go to the emotions. The negative instrumental, I'm so poor, I don't have work. So for each person, each of these 700 people, there was a story, okay? Given a story about, and that's how I coded it. So you can go and see what the codes are. The codes are for emotions and for negative instrumental. There's a little bit of back region, which I often coded it for the fact that people told an historical story of being evicted and needing to move on. Then the front region was actually the cases where people said, this place is so important, my kid is in the school just 2 kilometers down the road, you can't evict me. Or We've graded the roads between the informal settlements, therefore we've already got a sense of community. You should be very careful to evict us. So those were the stories from that. And then there's the historical struggle. So people would tell, in addition to some of this backreading stuff, people would tell long stories about, I was on that farm, I was evicted, I moved on to something else, and I was evicted again, and this happened, and I was evicted again. Okay, so so when I look at this whole story, there's the whole history of exclusion, and I want to say, I'll make the point a little bit later again, the whole history often is just within the apartheid context, but many of these people were evicted in a post-apartheid context in ways that plays out in power, etc. In this period. So that's that case. The word home appears 757 times in those stories, and the word homeless 179 times. Okay, so that's the story of the evictions. The second case then is Mrs. Yafta, that had the government house and actually lost it and then got it back. And here I actually coded the judgment. Okay, you will see that there are far less codes here, so it's not the typical eviction type of issue here, but there's still the issue about who the people are, how poor they are, how difficult it is to live, that they're located, and the judge, the Constitutional Court uses the word they're located in a small town, trying to say something of being a peripheral location, not having access to mainstream lawyers, and it probably tells something about the attorney firm that helped Mrs. Kuman to get Mrs. Yafta out of the house. The word home appears 10 times, and the word homeless 13 times. You can see that the relationship here, the word homeless now, is something very important in the judgment, far more than home, because they actually had a home. They actually had a house and a home in this process. Then I did the same with the Grootboom case, which is again the eviction case. And again, the same pattern, more or less the same pattern as case 1, and this is again the judgment of the Constitutional Court that I coded in this way. Alright, so that is the data. Okay, you can actually skip the next slides to the more that one. Yeah, so and I have changed a little bit my concluding comments after I've submitted, so it might be a little bit different from what you see there. So the question in my mind is what we see, or there's always the saying, be careful what you ask for, you'll get what you ask for. So is what we see in the data what we've asked for? Okay? Is it just a simple result of policy and law that gives us that give this type of result? All right. So the fact that there's so much emphasis on history in all the cases is part of how our laws have been written within a historical context, or is it because the lawyers perceive certain things to be important and therefore put that in and don't put in other things? So there's very little reflection, for example, on the agency of people. All right? So it seems like that's not important to anybody. How much I've added to this house through my own ability is not an important aspect. So it's very mechanistic about the law says these things, and therefore we code more or less the things that it would be expected in law. A couple of general comments. The huge emphasis on the negative side versus very little emphasis on the positive aspects of home. Now, obviously, these are eviction cases, and people try to portray a specific story. The second comment is the issue about emotion. So many of the Grootboom case was largely, if my understanding is correctly, done around the rights of children, and I've heard the same out the other day, that the children's rights are the important thing. So that's been confirmed in the judgment. The third thing is that generally in both eviction cases, the state obligation is a very important part of the deal. And in the first case, the state actually did very little initially. There was a court case against them initially, and they actually did nothing. There was an initial order against them, and they actually did very little to the case. So the state's ability, and especially local government's ability to do anything, is problematic. Then I think an important part is the whole issue of the front region, the emphasis on community, providing of some of their own services. So they were, in the first case, eviction case, they could say that we've provided services to this community, there's water available, etc. Was a way of saying this place is ours. The historical concerns I found very interesting, both in the Grootboom case and in the first case. For the reason in the Grootboom case, the judge actually goes in quite a lengthy way describing the apartheid history and exclusion of black people in urban areas. However, in the first case, I would argue that a large degree of these people were actually evicted post-1994 in a dispensation that would be much fairer, but where the power relationships are still very much dominated by white people and especially white farmers in the process. But I do think there's a sort of a point where the courts don't recognize the current problem, they just recognize the historical problem. And I'm not sure that is exactly helpful in this process. There's an interesting thing about the consent to settle in an area. So especially in the first case that I had, so there was a farm manager which was black, and he was used as a proxy to say that they got permission from someone managing the farm to settle there. Now, in 700 of the cases that didn't work, the court went back to a system where the length of stay was the main proxy for deciding whether you need to move out or not move out. I think the sense of community and the right to housing comes out in a number of cases. I've spoken about peripheral location. So, the last couple of comments, there's minimal reference to, I've said that, so to the current laws that create the same housing problem, so I've said that. I've spoken about the obligation of the state and the incapacity of the state. And this is maybe the following two comments of maybe my biggest concern, not being a lawyer myself, so to try and say that the rights are often seen loose from household poverty. So housing, or the court decision, often seems to be an end in itself. And the courts don't understand what the value is of ensuring stability in households, ensuring a place where people can't be just moved in and out as people wish. And I think there's a so if you look at that stories people told in case one, what they actually want to tell is we want a place where we won't be evicted. And the courts very mechanically look at that situation. They just look at the time frame. They don't look at what it means, what an eviction order means or not mean. And I'm not sure what depth they should be doing it, but it is at least in the judgment or in the affidavit any indication that people think beyond the security of the right to a large degree. And the same way, I think the courts don't take into account the agency of people, their ability to build themselves. There's very little understanding about the type of investments that were made. That doesn't feature in the court. And if we think about home, those type of things, my own design, those type of things are very important. I've spoken about the progressive housing right, or the progressive issue around housing earlier. And I've spoken about the housing rights are often seen as an end in itself, and I think we could look at it a little bit different. Denise, thank you very much.
Thank you. And he please come and sit here. Gente, nós Obrigada, Maria Fernanda.
Vai ter que se postar agora.
Gostei.
Tá, né?
Nós vamos abrir então agora. Thank you very much for wonderful lectures and wonderful presentations. And we are going to. Sorry?
I said you speak English.
Well, we always love this. Ok. Nós vamos abrir então para pergunta. Now you have to. Nós vamos abrir para as perguntas. Alguém quer fazer alguma pergunta, gente? Tiago, João, Dani. Vamos fazer 3, depois a gente faz mais. Tiago, eu preciso que vocês venham aqui para poder fazer a tradução, falar no microfone e fazer a tradução, ok? Você pode falar em português. Uma delícia.
A pergunta para o Ed. Primeiro, eu acho que eu queria entender um pouco mais ou menos sobre essa diferença do sistema de advocacia na Inglaterra. Assim. Essa coisa do solicitor e do barrister. Acho que me confundi um pouco, ajudaria a entender o ponto que você tentou trazer. Assim. E segundo, se a proposta da Law Clinic, assim, da clínica de direito, mais grassroots, assim, mais de base, uma coisa que eu acho que a gente passa aqui também, talvez, assim, em alguns projetos, algumas coisas, seria como seria a relação dessa Law Clinic, desses profissionais com as pessoas com as pessoas, grupos, coletivos que cursos de direitos, essa Law Clinic vai tentar trazer, assim. Se existe, uma busca ativa, se essa busca ativa às vezes não fere um pouco essa posição do advogado, assim, tanto do coletivo de advogados quanto dos advogados individualmente considerados, assim. E, enfim, acho que seria mais essa questão.
João, pode vir aqui, por favor?
Boa noite. Muito obrigado. Eu queria fazer 3 perguntas interrelacionadas aqui para o Nicolas. A primeira fiquei com a seguinte questão: o que conta como possessão e o que conta como propriedade? O que é que algumas coisas, algumas terras, são consideradas posses, possessões, e outras são propriedade? Qual é a linha divisória que demarca como que a lei opera nesse sentido? A segunda tem a ver com isso, e um pouco mais do ponto de vista geográfico. Será que isso tem a ver com o fato de estarmos tratando de corpos moventes, precários, em oposição a modelos de propriedade que são fixos no território? E terceiro, de que ponto os ativistas e os movimentos que lutam junto com os moradores de rua, você está estudando, se utilizam noções de direito e de propriedade diferentes da noção de propriedade tradicional, privada, excludente, e que resultados têm sido obtidos nesse sentido. Obrigado.
Dani, a gente ri.
Thank you very much for being very interesting papers. I always talk. Question or remark for each 3. First, to Nick, I think you're absolutely right. This is a really unexplored area. There are 2 areas where, in very practical legal terms, the control that precarious people have over their possessions has come up quite a bit in South Africa. One I spoke with you about before is in the course of evictions, of unlawful evictions, where possessions are destroyed. That used to be a particular tactic of the apartheid government during elections to make it impossible for people to return. And it is a tactic that is employed more and more by local government institutions in South Africa also. Our law has struggled dealing with that where possessions are destroyed, because the remedy that's usually utilized in the context of an unlawful election is spoliation. And spoliation is a common law remedy, and our courts have said that spoliation is simply a possessory remedy, so it's intended to restore possession, and you cannot restore possession of something that's been destroyed. So that's one context. The other is, I wonder whether you can look also at street vendors. In South Africa, there's a great deal of litigation around street vendors and street vendors being removed by police, and in the course of that removal, not only their goods are confiscated and sold off by the police in corrupt fashion, but also their tables or their trays on which they display their goods that are either confiscated or destroyed. I was wondering, just very quickly, because we have a similar process, we've had a similar process in South Africa to the one you're referring to. Is the intention that professional legal training is collapsed entirely into university legal training?
Whose intention?
Excuse me?
The intention of the regulator.
The regulator, yes. Is that where this is heading? Or in South Africa, there's a clear distinction between university legal training, which is supposed to be conceptual in the first place, and then a period of conceptual, concept of practical legal training on the job. And there's a constant struggle between practice and university, the one trying to pass off its responsibilities. Lochner, one or two remarks. The first is, I think there's a difficulty perhaps with looking in these cases at the affidavits, because although the affidavits are supposed to reflect the story of the actual people in the case, affidavits are drafted by lawyers on the basis of consultation, but they are drafted also strategically. So there is a move on the side of the legal practitioner to insert the key words that are necessary to make the case. That's the first thing. Simply embroidering a bit on the story of the Javka case. In that case, it's as you said, a case of repossession of property to fabricate stolen execution. The date in question was the date of 237 man. 237 man, that's not even 100 reals. And her house was sold, and the process according to the scam that was operated to sell her house was that the house would be sold at an auction that was run by the attorney that brought the case against her. The house is sold for just the amount, very little more than the amount of debt. And it is bought by the attorney that runs the auction, and it is then sold off for a much larger amount. So that's just to sketch the integrity that occurred.
Thank you. Well, thank you for these wonderful papers. I find it very interesting in Lochner's work on how many of the things that are cited in the chart are things that we actually heard here. For example, in Mundo, this was that community leader was all the time saying about the children, what are we are going to leave for our children, and this kind of emotional arguments that are attached to the idea of a house, which are
more important to all of us, I think, than the price of the house. This is one of the problems of commoditizing houses. You just disconsider other kinds of senses of home to the people. Here in Brazil we have this law practice, and it is in the clinics. All law schools have to have clinic, and the students have to have certain hours not necessarily in the clinic. They can do it in the clinic or in private law firms, or even in courts or in other spaces. But I feel that these law clinics, they do not work as Polos works, for example. And we have not managed in Polos to transform our practice into the rule. We are always an exception. We're a little crazy. Here in the law school, people think we are crazy. Yeah, we are like all those lefties there, to do their stuff. And it is interesting that the profile of students that go for our practice, it is very common that the law students that come to Polos say, I'm almost abandoning the course, I don't want to do law, I want to do something else. And then they go to Polos to say, okay, this is the last chance that I like law. If I don't like Polos, I'm just dropping off the course. We have a lot of students with this profile. But what is interesting is that they stay in the law school after they go through Polos. So we have never had a drop off after coming to Polos. They say, okay, maybe law makes some sense and it can have some potential of doing some change. But our law clinic, I think, works in a more traditional way, which is what I see in Brazil as a very strong force, and I think this seminar has shown that, is outreach. It's more than the clinic, is the idea of outreach. And we have managed to think of new practices through the outreach, uniting outreach programs with the research. More than the idea of a clinic, because why? Why do I think that maybe this is the case? Because the clinic, as you said, in the case of the UK, is very focused on market. What is the law market, and how do I prepare people for the law market? And the law market is still hegemonically big law firms that can pay more. So many of the students that have come from Polos and today are lawyers, many of them have gone to the ones that don't go to public service, Defensor's Office, Ministério Público. They have tried to have a law firm, radical law firm, popular law firm, as we say here, and I think they are having a lot of trouble of paying the bills of this law firm. This is one of the things they have to solve, right, ladies? Right? They have to pay the bills. You know, they have to live out of this thing, this talent they have, but at the same time that they have this problem. As to Nick's, I wanted also to do an observation on Nick's presentation. In Polos, we have one of our streams of research is with streets, population, people that are living in the streets. And we actually have we had a big fight. Many of the outreach programs involved in this fight many of them that you met along the seminar, to overrule, I think is a word, to overrule a regulation of the city that permitted the city hall to take the private property from the street population. The belongings, yes, the belongings of street population. And this, I think, happened also in São Paulo, right? And in other places in Brazil. And today we are facing another aspect of this, and I read it as the same aspect, as a development of the same kind of thing. So they started doing these regulations in different cities to take the belongings. In these cases, many of the lawyers try to say, well, first the defense of private property in a way, and also the idea of homes. How, for example, precarious shelter in the street can be defined as home, or just a bag with a bunch of personal belongings is home. Wherever this bag is, this is home. So this is one of the aspects. But this has developed to another thing that we are facing right now, which is regulations to take the babies from the mothers that are living in the streets. And the kind of logic is the same logic as property logic. It is very weird how they do this, you know. And right now we have a huge case in Belo Horizonte. We have a team in Pós following these mothers together with the medicine school here in UFMG. Many of the public service doctors and nurses that have refused, because we have a regulation, an order from the courts of children and adolescents, that whenever a street population woman comes into the hospital, they have to report it to the judge, so he can send an order to take the baby. And what happens is some of these doctors and nurses have refused in this in a civil disobedience movement to report it, saying that they are covered by the ethics and medical ethics code, and they are facing processes today because of doing this. What I think is interesting that links to your presentation is that the kind of logic is very similar to this property. Thank you.
I just want to say that we from the architecture field has the same problem that we have in the law school. And I think the key is we work with people, we work in the territories, Pós, Praxis, FAO from São Paulo. So all the groups from the universities which work together with people in the territories face the problem because we work in another logic completely different from the market one. So it's very difficult for the students to leave the universities after working within this logic and then face the market. They are not able to do it. So that's why it's difficult to pay the people. But on the other hand, what should they do? To be the other side now? Or to work on the market together with the market? So it's a choice. Sorry?
Yeah.
Or become a professor. Yes. But it's true. I started, I decided to come to university because I could not tolerate the market, the private market. So I had to go to the university. Although nowadays I'm not sure if it's a good choice.
very much. I spent a long time talking about this, but I don't think we need to do that. Well, thank you so much for the comments there about possession of property. So legally, they're distinct, right? So if you possess something, you just hold it, right? So I'm in possession of this cup right now, but I don't have title to that. So I think this is actually a distinction. So the the authorities will often assume that, for example, the vendor they're in possession of their stuff. They don't. It's not their stuff. It's stolen. So you do see that. And you do see also other sorts of survival strategies. So one of the issues, for example, is recycling. People scavenging cans. I see them, people who go around and take people without recycling, and then people will come along and take the recycling away. Legally, those cans belong to the municipality. And so, in fact, people can be penalised as a consequence. The mobile fixed thing is a very interesting one, and it's certainly, I think, important here, and it's worth thinking about. In terms of the way activists think about things, we haven't started really digging into this. People will say it's my stuff, but when they say it's my stuff, I think they're saying it's like home, right? They're saying multiple things. Some of that is like, I own this thing, or I paid for this thing. But some of it is also, I think, an argument about equality. I own this stuff. People take away my stuff. The rich people own stuff. They don't take away this. Right? So it's actually a claim for equality and then also for personal dignity. But it raises questions. We're worried about this, right? So, do we end up articulating a claim that marginalised people should have the right to private property and should be protected against the overwhelming, the overbearing power of the state? It's not something I really want to go into. But of course, the question then becomes, what does property serve? Property is a means to an end. So, the question then becomes, what are the ends of which property? Danny, thank you for those connections there. So I've already heard women talk about, I lost my stuff and I lost my children, and it's striking because they'll talk about them as not as interchangeable, but because clearly they're not, but the kind of gender politics of this. So I had one woman say, large men came and took away my stuff, right? The landlord just seized their stuff illegally, and then large men came and took away my children. So that sense of kind of gender trauma and violence and so on. Then also what's striking, and you hear this again and again, is they take away my children. All I have left are my photographs. Now I've lost my phone. Or I've lost my phone.
Thank you. Right, okay. I'll try and be quick. The difference between solicitors and barristers. Didn't do any difference then. But basically, historically, it's very different. The difference really is that as a solicitor, barristers always got paid a lot more than me. That was my experience. There's a question of who can speak in court. So historically, the barristers were the people able to stand up in court and speak, so they were the advocates. Solicitors would instruct the barristers, would deal with the clients, would be responsible for negotiating, and then would draft a brief to counsel, the barrister, to go and do the oral advocacy. Increasingly, the division is falling away as more and more solicitors have higher rights and are able to represent people in higher courts. And increasingly barristers are able to see clients individually. So increasingly there's less of it. They're regulated in slightly different ways, but the majority of the legal profession are solicitors, and there's this small group of barristers who tend to be they tend to focus on the more complex cases. Purpose of the law clinic. I think it's fair to say that there's a great degree of variation in law clinics in the UK, but the ones that might be capable of offering qualifying work experience, the ones I'm particularly sort of interested in focusing on, are very traditional. They're like a law firm, they're like a law clinic. They are, you'll have an office and the client can see you, will take their case. You may just advise them, or you may take the case further. We have a whole building in Kent which is very attractive, which does exactly that kind of work. But I think it's as I said, what I'm keen on doing is keeping the space for students to do things differently, and that's why I accept that it's not every law school in Brazil that does this. And I also, I hope I cited Praxis, maybe I missed the cited Praxis, but it's the work that Polos does, that Praxis does, that those of you who are doing other kinds of work in other kinds of spaces who are here, because we've heard a whole range of this kind of work in the time I've been here, and it's just so impressive. It's that I'm referring to. I talk more about Polos because I've heard more of Polos, but it's the interdisciplinary aspect of it, it's the relation between research and learning, taking with the community and saying, what do you need, how can we work together to affect change for you, and to think about methodologies which are productive of justice and attentive to nuance. And I think that's what there isn't an emphasis on that in the UK, and that's what I want to create space for. And yes, it's difficult to know what people might go on to do out of that, but it's about, for me, it's about citizenship. It's about knowing that if you go to university, you have the opportunity to do those kinds of things, to understand there are different ways to be, different imaginaries, and whatever you go and do, you've had an opportunity to see the world in that kind of way. And so I think, coming to your question, Dan, the reason this really matters is because what's going on is the regulators taking their hands off. So rather than insisting that things be folded into an undergraduate degree or leaving it, they're basically saying you can do any degree, you don't just do a law degree. Then you have to go and sit this multiple choice examination. And for example, property law, if you are tested on property law, which you have to be, it's 30 multiple choice questions to cover the entirety of property law, which you'll do in an hour, 2 minutes per question. And then, you understand property law, so that's great. And universities get to choose whether or not to fold that into their provision, or to say, we're not touching this because it's a stupid idea and it doesn't contribute towards being a good lawyer. And what we're seeing is universities which are more focused on education, universities which don't have the same reputation in research terms, they're called the Russell Group in the UK. I don't know if you've come across this term, but the top group of universities in the UK which get most of the research money are called the Russell Group, and the rest of the universities focus more on education. Those universities which focus on education are folding this into their law degrees. So basically what they're doing is they're taking what is currently a 4 or 5 year course, they're turning it to a 3-year course, taking out optional modules, focusing much more on skills, focusing much more on the things you need to pass the test. And the top universities are saying, we want nothing to do with this, this is a terrible idea. If you come to us, then you go off and you get to choose to be a lawyer or whatever you want to do. We've given you a training. Now, my problem with this, I think it's a recipe for benevolence. It's a recipe for saying, first of all, if you're from a working class background or a background where you don't get such good advice and you want to be a lawyer, you might be more likely to go to university which gets you to be a lawyer quicker, but doesn't get you to be a lawyer quite well, I would say. Or you go to a Russell Group university, but then you've got to find some way of learning all of the stupid stuff you've got to learn to pass the test. So you've got to get funding for that, because you have to do a cram course. And who's going to fund you? It's going to cost you extra on top of your law degree. So the only way to do that is either to go to the market or to borrow a load of money. If you borrow a load of money, can you then think about going into a sort of law where you don't earn any money? Maybe the very top group of people, the people who are really incredible, who get to go and be the very top barristers, maybe they can still do this area of work. But that's why I say I think it's a recipe for benevolence. It's a recipe for kind of, you have to take a risk, you have to be confident that you can do this work, you are good enough to be there, that says something about a particular type of student. And you have to also be willing to push yourself and get into a load of debt, and then, you have to take this route. So,
White rich man.
sorry?
White rich man.
Yeah, white rich men, exactly. I mean, it's not like it's great at the moment, but it promises, I think, to make things worse. And so, what I'm focused on is trying to keep a space for something different. It's also worth saying that what I should have said is they ran the pilot program on this. They haven't introduced this yet. They ran the pilot program to see how the test would work. And when they first started it, the multiple choice test also had a little part where you had to do legal skills. And the people running it discovered that the legal skills part of it was, when it was independently assessed, it was racist. Because if you were white, you were more likely to do better in it than if you were black. And so they're now trying to work out whether or not they can run this test at all. It's pretty shocking that they're talking about even going forward with the test, which they've demonstrated on their own terms which are incredibly flawed, is a racist test. So this might not happen. If it does happen, it's an indictment of our legal system that this gets pushed through. All I'm keen on doing is trying to keep us system. So, thank you.
Yeah, you can stay on it.
I see there's 18 minutes left, and I use all 18 minutes.
It's up to you.
I think, Maria, the point is, and that's what I see. So I sat in many of these meetings in the early 90s, and the type of arguments which I now see in court cases, what's in Brazil and South Africa in the 90s, which we experienced in the 90s and the late 80s, are generally the same. I've lost a little bit of track on the later stuff, so I can't talk too much of more recent land, but what I experienced at the end of the 80s, early 90s, and the stories are much the same. In terms of Donnie's comment about the affidavit, so this was, I initially did the coding and I thought, oh my word, what did I do? And then something struck me, and that's why I kept it, that the coding for case 1 and for case 3 more or less are similar. Meaning, as the attorneys actually redo this in their way, that's what the judges do with it on the other hand. And that's my comment about be careful what you ask for in law. The lawyers will do what you ask them, and that will be taken up, well, the judges will actually reflect on that in some other way in words. However, I think the argument that I didn't bring out that well is that is in terms of an understanding of, a very narrow type of definition in general, to my mind. That was my 18 minutes.
Alguém mais quer fazer uma pergunta? Ou a gente pode encerrar? Ótimo. Antes de passar a palavra para a Maria Fernanda, para ela encerrar esse evento, eu gostaria de falar brevíssimas palavras. Esse foi o terceiro dia de um evento extremamente intenso.
She's not going to speak English.
No, not anymore. Yeah, not anymore. Anyway, foi um terceiro dia de um evento extremamente intenso, mas também extremamente produtivo para todo mundo, embora tenho certeza que estamos extremamente cansados, mas eu acho que ao final nós aprendemos muito com todas as apresentações dos pesquisadores e de diversas áreas do conhecimento e também de distintas regiões do país e do mundo. E um evento que foi possível somente em razão do que nos move individualmente, como professores, mas também coletivamente, como grupos de pesquisa e redes de pesquisa, que é a produção do conhecimento e a transformação, em alguma medida, do país que nós vivemos. É o terceiro evento que a gente faz dessa rede, então acho que isso explica tamanha naturalidade em que a gente tem conduzido as apresentações, as mesas. Estamos juntos já há quantos anos? 3, quase, né? 3 anos. Mas eu queria dizer o seguinte, que grande parte da sociedade brasileira não sabe o que a gente está fazendo dentro das universidades e não quer saber o que a gente está fazendo na universidade. Durante esse evento, eu li que a nossa principal agência de pesquisa teve o seu orçamento reduzido em 87% para o ano que vem, em um orçamento que já é exíguo desse ano, de 2019. Eu acho que a grande parte da sociedade brasileira as universidades públicas brasileiras estão sendo destruídas pela má-fé e pela ignorância. Então, eu não consigo encerrar esse evento sem, primeiro, agradecer a todos que vieram às suas casas, Belo Horizonte, São Paulo, Rio, nossos convidados, que vieram sem apoio financeiro, Brasília, e também Espanha, Canadá, Inglaterra, África do Sul. E eu acho que a gente tem que pensar num compromisso que não é só deles, como eu já pedi a eles a fazer esse compromisso, mas de todos nós precisamos contar à sociedade brasileira o que a UFMG faz, o que a UFMG é, o que a UFMG produz. Eu tenho certeza que nós estamos do lado certo da história e, ultimamente, eu tenho dito que eu fico muito feliz de estar do lado esquerdo dessa história. Então, agradeço a todo mundo. Vou passar a palavra para a Maria Fernanda. Obrigada.
Gente, em primeiro lugar, umas coisas práticas. Nos próximo mês, possivelmente, né, daqui a um mês, eu devo enviar para vocês que apresentaram trabalho, que estiveram aqui, uma chamada de trabalhos para quem quiser publicar. Né, nós vamos, como produto dessa rede, a gente vai combinou de fazer 2 livros, um que fale mais sobre políticas de habitação e um que pode ser mais da parte teórica. Então, a gente vai receber esses perfis de trabalhos, não só aqui do Brasil, de quem participou deste evento, como também os trabalhos que foram apresentados na África do Sul e que foram apresentados na Inglaterra. Então, vocês vão receber essa chamada com uma data, né, para entregar, com prazo, e esperamos ter contribuições, porque, de fato, o evento, né, as comunicações, tudo que foi apresentado foi de altíssimo nível, de altíssima qualidade, mostrando isso que a Denise disse, né, que nós temos... eu sei disso, eu sei do que ela disse, mas ver isso e sentir isso nesses 2 dias, quer dizer, ver a qualidade dos trabalhos, como essas pesquisas estão se articulando, a força que essas pesquisas têm de mudança nos próprios territórios, né, é incrível, assim, é uma coisa que emociona mesmo, e eu acho que a gente tem, de fato, que se manter firme, né, e nossa perspectiva é o fortalecimento dessa rede que nós estamos aqui culminando a primeira etapa dela, já com a pretensão de fazer uma segunda etapa, e mais ou menos nossos planos são submeter uma proposta para alguns editais que a gente está estudando, e além disso, além desses livros que eu já falei aqui para vocês, o Ed e a Helen se comprometeram também a montar uma página da rede que ficará hospedada na Universidade de Kent, onde também a gente vai ter bastantes informações, a gente deve pôr bastantes coisas, inclusive as fotos belíssimas, né, filmes e tudo que a gente teve, as imagens que a gente colheu desses 3 encontros, e vocês estarão lá e esperamos que vocês também continuem contribuindo para isso tudo, né? Eu queria agradecer muito a todo mundo que participou e a todo mundo que se esforçou para que o evento acontecesse. De fato, minha gratidão eterna, sabe, por tudo que aconteceu. Gostei muito do evento, estou muito cansada e estou muito feliz também. Assim, é um cansaço bom, sabe? Aquele cansaço de, olha, as coisas deu certo, que incrível, como eu aprendi, como eu estou satisfeita, eu agradeço muito a todos que se envolveram para que isso acontecesse. E minha palavra final é similar a essa da Denise. Nós, entre as tarefas que tivemos na organização, nós submetemos um pedido de financiamento à CAPES, porque essa é a forma como a gente faz no Brasil já há muitos anos. A CAPES é uma instituição consolidada dentro do Brasil para financiamento de pesquisa. E, tradicionalmente, não era assim um sistema, grandes coisas, o sistema tem vários defeitos, mas tradicionalmente a gente submetia uma proposta, a equipe técnica da CAPES olhava se a documentação estava completa. Se não estivesse completa, você era desclassificado pela equipe técnica da CAPES e não ia para a próxima etapa. Se a documentação estava completa, eles enviavam para peer review. Eles enviavam para que os nossos pares dissessem se aquele evento era ou não relevante. E perante esses pareceres, nós obtínhamos o financiamento para os eventos. O que tem acontecido nesses últimos meses é que a equipe técnica da CAPES está desclassificando eventos com bases ideológicas. E o nosso foi um desses. Um que eu tenho parceria também com meus colegas da UFMG da FARI, com Bolonha, com a Universidade de Bolonha na Itália, foi também do mesmo jeito, não foi para peer review. A equipe técnica da CAPES desclassificou aquele evento também. E o exemplo mais gritante que nós tivemos foi de amigos nossos aqui também, do constitucionalismo decolonial, um evento que está na 15ª edição, que eles submeteram, sempre obtiveram os seus financiamentos pela CAPES, e a nota, o e-mail que foi enviado pela CAPES dizia: não financiamos eventos político-partidários. Essas pessoas, hoje, do Ministério da Educação, inclusive o ministro da Educação, o desministro da Educação, está tendo que explicar perante o Senado Federal do Brasil esse parecer. E deveria explicar todos, inclusive do nosso evento. Porque há hoje uma perseguição ideológica dentro das universidades. O governo federal está intervindo nas escolhas dos reitores, nas escolhas internas dos reitores. Nós temos várias universidades federais nessa situação, 6 nesse momento. Eles estão possivelmente colocando também, como era na ditadura militar, pessoas para vigiar a gente dentro das salas de aula, dentro dos órgãos colegiados, enfim. Isso aí, eu já tive situações dentro de sala de aula com alunos que, de fato, são estranhos, dentro da Universidade Federal, questionando dentro dos argumentos da cartilha de um movimento que existe aqui no Brasil chamado Escola Sem Partido. E esse Escola Sem Partido, que na verdade é escola da extrema-direita, é um movimento de escola com partido, muito bem assinado, com assinatura, com nome e assinatura. Ele está querendo fazer o controle ideológico, quer fazer o controle das nossas pesquisas e quer desmoralizar os professores. E aí eu fico me perguntando, por que desmoralizar a universidade pública, gratuita e de alta qualidade que nós temos no Brasil? Nós temos aqui exemplos de países, de pessoas que são de países onde houve processos de privatização da universidade pública, onde os alunos hoje batalham com o crédito estudantil para poder pagar as dívidas das universidades. Se nós achamos que em 2008 o mundo quase quebrou por causa da crise imobiliária, o financiamento estudantil nos Estados Unidos hoje é maior do que a dívida imobiliária de 2008. Ela é maior. Então, as universidades são capazes de quebrar, né, essas dívidas que os alunos têm, são capazes de quebrar o mundo também, como aconteceu em 2008. E o Brasil conseguiu, durante anos e anos, resistir a essa mercantilização da educação superior. Nós conseguimos consolidar universidades públicas de altíssimo nível, de altíssima qualidade, com pesquisa, com extensão, com ensino de alta qualidade, públicas e inteiramente gratuitas para os alunos. E é isso que está em jogo, é isso que está sendo atacado nesse momento. Por quê? Pelo potencial de transformação que nós temos. E eu acho que para os visitantes, né, fica claro, vendo não só os trabalhos apresentados, como indo nos territórios, qual é a capacidade revolucionária desses trabalhos. É por isso que a gente está sendo atacado. Qual é a nossa obrigação hoje? Resistir. E resistir porque nos territórios que nós trabalhamos, nós que estamos nesse assunto de habitação, nos territórios que a gente trabalha, nós trabalhamos com pessoas como populações quilombolas, populações indígenas, homens e mulheres negros, pobres, que sobreviveram a esse país durante mais de 500 anos. Essas pessoas já sobreviveram, elas já são sobreviventes, elas têm as estratégias de sobrevivência. Nós vamos ficar nos queixando? Nós temos que lutar junto com eles. Eles sabem resistir, nós temos que aprender com eles como se resiste. Eles estão vivos há 500 anos. Né? Então, agradeço muito a todos vocês.
Gente, infelizmente, eu tenho que dizer que quem vai para Brumadinho amanhã é às 7 da manhã.
We'll see you tomorrow. You going with tomorrow on the bus?
Yeah, are we going to get very good to see you. Ah, já está definido.
I'm tired of you
It has been. But the thing is that the only way I can put it was when you roll off that I went to
Yeah, no, we are not going to for a long time. It's exhausting. I have to eat because I didn't have to go to the supermarket, so my house there is nothing to eat. Otherwise, I have to have some life. So that's why. My daughter is not happy.
Agora tá fresquinho.
Alô, alô, som, som. Alô, 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 som. 1, 2, 3, som.
Chaves, eu vou te passar os dados, eu vou precisar que você faça uma nota assim, ó. Você vai fazer no nome da UFMG, com o CNPJ do UFMG, e lá naquele lugar onde, lá embaixo, na nota fiscal, tem como fazer umas observações.
Sim.
Então ali eu vou te mandar, isso, vou te mandar um textinho que fala assim, do evento tal, de acordo com o convênio tal, 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 entendeu? Especificando o convênio, porque aí eu consigo receber deles. Então o que nós fizemos foi pagar o dinheiro, eu consigo te pagar a segunda, porque todo dia ele está tendo que, pouquinho a pouquinho, tirar um bocado do dinheiro.
Sim.
Ele só solta 2.500 por dia. Entendeu? É coisa de cartão de crédito, né? Então ele está soltando 2.500 por dia, então até domingo a gente consegue tirar o dinheiro todo, e aí segunda depois você me manda, acho que você me mandou já as informações, me manda as informações.
No ano passado era igual, mas eu te mando tudo de novo.
Tá.
A nota fiscal, eu posso colocar os detalhes de depósito e um pouco da nota também, depois daquilo que você falou, dados bancários para depósito. Fica configurado, que está autorizado para cair na minha conta e de que vai ser feito direto no nome da própria empresa. Que dá uma ratinha assim. Eu também tenho que destacar os impostos que a lei manda.
Pois é, claro. Não, tranquilo. Olha, muitíssimo obrigada.
Bom participar do negócio deles. Foi terrível isso de educação, aceitação de filhos. Eu lembrei depois de separar filhos.
Oi, aqui nós estamos com esse problema aqui. Hein?
Os pais foram protestar na praça lá, deixaram os meninos com não sei quem, enquanto eles foram protestar, eles foram tomar a criança por abandono.
Olha isso.
Ficou associando esse negócio de separação.
Aqui também está assim,
muito ruim.
os juízes dando autorização para tirar das mães. Você precisa de ver os depoimentos que nós temos, assim, de mães saindo do hospital com o peito jorrando leite, que tinha acabado de ganhar neném, e eles vão lá e tomam o neném, sem devido processo legal, sem fazer o processo bonitinho, de adoção bonitinho, como tem que ser, sem olhar casa a casa, entendeu? Simplesmente arranca o neném. Que horror, que horror. Aí nós estamos acompanhando, a gente tem um observatório dessas coisas chamadas PADU. Tem até na internet, sabe? Acompanhando a plataforma de direitos humanos. E aí a gente vem acompanhando vários casos.
Eu vi a direita enquanto eu pensei assim, vai ser um período de 4 anos, vai dar uma sacudida, o pessoal está com raiva do PT, aquela coisa toda. Mas o Estado está assim, todos os níveis.
Vamos ver, né? Mas tem capacidade de reação, não pode. Ah, isso aqui eu quero pegar também, que eu vou querer guardar isso aqui. A recordação. Sim, eles foram na maleta? Então você vai entrar, porque eu tenho que resolver umas coisas. Tchau.
Aqui deixei a mesa funcionando do jeito que estava quando a gente chegou.
Ah, beleza.
A Rafaela estava muito preocupada, olhava para mim desconfiada. Aí ela entendeu que a gente sabia um pouquinho de coisa, ela falou assim, mas essa mesa, eu conheço muito essa mesa. Compraram não sei quantos para toda a Universidade Federal, né? Todo lado tem. Agora, em algumas salas, esse aqui já foi aposentado, está encostado, e já entraram nesses digitais também.
Esse aí é memória.
É analógico, mas é um sistema fantástico isso aí. Mas é muito difícil de entender. Agora, o digital é várias vezes mais difícil de entender do que isso aí. Então, a gente chega e olha assim, se não tiver um operador contratado que saiba operar o digital, ao menos esse aí eu já sei entrar e sair dessa mesa. Mas eu tive que adaptar, voltei para um sistema paralelo, senão não saía áudio para a gente lá.
Entendi.
Então, entre os microfones todos aqui, o som daqui para aquela mesa, e só funcionou uma das duas caixas, ninguém percebeu. Agora voltou o jeito que estava. Parte de trabalhar. Esse aqui é de vocês?
Não, isso tudo
Da
a
sala.
Rafaela vai recolher.
Tá.
Eu vou encostar a porta e eles vêm recolher.
A gente avisa os porteiros que a gente sai para eles poderem fechar.
Exatamente.